guess, I don't know if I have a clicker, but that's fine. So my name is Isabela. We're going to be looking at some cool SVGs in React today. A little bit about me before we jump in, some very important things. There we go. This is my dog. I like to include a picture of him. Oh, wow, thank you so much. I like to include a picture of him in every talk just because he's a good boy. And he's home by himself, so like that's the least I could do for him, right? And second, I'm a senior UX engineer at a startup here in Seattle, and we're called Cedar AI. And we work with a bunch of train optimization stuff. So I've learned a lot of fun facts about trains in the last 4 months, and if anyone is curious, come find me after the talk. Like, I promise they're actually fun facts. A little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at what SVGs are. Then we're going to jump into creating an SVG, and then creating a React component out of this SVG. And then for the rest of the time, I'm just going to live code some cool stuff. This talk is not a comprehensive deep dive into SVGs. I am not an SVG pro. This is not an end-to-end tutorial. But it's a good intro into working with SVGs, the applications, the pros and cons, and it's just going to be some fun, and hopefully you guys will also have like some practical aspects to this talk. So before we dive in, what are SVGs? So SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphic. And when you think about images, you usually think about JPEGs or PNGs, and these images are basically made up of this thing called a bitmap, which is, if you have a 100 by 100 image, you have a grid of 100 by 100, and it defines the color at that specific pixel. And this is fine, but as you can see, when you zoom in to your raster image, as they're called, you get like really fuzzy lines, right? Because you can't really define things beyond the scope of like the 100 by 100 pixels that you have. So with SVGs, instead of defining things on a pixel basis, your image is made up of points in space, and these points are connected by straight lines or curved lines or whatever. So it's basically just like math. And it's really nice because when you zoom into it, like the pixels are recalculated and you get a nice, like still smooth and not pixelated image. And this is kind of what an SVG looks like. You can design them in these like design tools like Photoshop or Illustrator, things like that. But at the end of the day, an SVG is just code. So that's great because now we don't have to go to designers every time we want to like make changes to an illustration. So here we can see that we have an SVG tag, just like what you would see in HTML. And then we have a rect tag, and that just defines some rectangle. So here we have something that's 100 by 100, and then we can give it any CSS styling we want. And so this code gives us a blue square with a red outline. It's pretty straightforward. Then you start getting into more complicated stuff, and I'm not going to cover a lot of these. But basically, instead of defining a rectangle or a circle, you can define an arbitrary path. And the D argument or attribute is just a bunch of commands for like how you define these paths. And we're not going to get too much into it because I don't know a lot about it. It seems pretty confusing. But we're going to use this to our advantage to kind of show you like how you can look at code that you have no idea what it does and make it like work for you. So why even SVGs, right? We already have JPEGs and PNGs, like why bother? SVGs are great because they're editable. Like we just saw, it's just code. So it's really easy to like dig in there and maybe like change some hex values and things without having to like launch this like illustrative tool. They're really performant too. Normally, if you would have like a PNG or a JPEG, if your image is 100 by 100, that file size is going to be a lot smaller than a file size that's 1,000 by 1,000 image, because you need to define each pixel. But with SVGs, because they're scalable, you don't have to worry about it. It's just code, and no matter how big or small you make the image, it doesn't change the file size. And then finally, SVGs are accessible, which is great. We love accessibility. Let's talk a little bit about that before we get into live coding. It's great because it works really well for vision impaired users. A lot of vision impaired users will zoom into websites, and when you zoom into a website that has raster images, things get fuzzy, especially if there's text in the images. And so SVGs are really nice for that. And assistive technologies pretty much work out of the box with inline SVGs. And so a few things that we can take advantage of with assistive technologies and SVGs are using title and description tags to describe our SVGs. So here we can see that before we even do any of the rendering code in our SVG, like with rectangles and paths, we can give a title and a description and then use the ARIA labels to hook those up. And then we can also use roles to give more context. So a lot of times you'll have maybe like an infographic that you create as an SVG, and you might have links that you want to embed in there or different like interactivity things that you want to add. And so with SVGs, we can really easily add tags, give things roles, and keyboarding just kind of works out of the box with them. So now let's live code, the part that terrifies me the most. Let's see. So I'm going to be using Figma and React. Figma is just the design tool that I work on every day. Here's a little robot thing that was illustrated. And so here on the left side, you can see, hopefully, all of these vectors. And these are just different parts of my robot's body. And so these are just points in space. And so what I'm going to do, since this guy's already created, I can just go in here and export it as an SVG. And if I go into my robot.svg, hopefully you guys can all see, this is super zoomed in, this is that robot. And it looks terrifying. Yeah, it's horrible. I have no idea what any of these paths do or mean, but I'm a great React developer. So I just copy and pasted this SVG into a functional component. And localhost 3000, there it is. He's like rendered as a React component. And I just did that by calling my robot tag. And so this is great. He's a little boring, a little like just kind of plain looking. Maybe as the parent, as like the consumer of this component, I want to be able to customize some things for my SVG. And so the first thing that kind of comes to mind is let's give the consumer an option to change its body color. And so again, like I have no idea what that SVG code is doing, but I'm a great developer and I love dev tools. And so if I just come in here, I'm like, okay, I want to change its body color. So I'm going to inspect the color of the robot's head. And I'm just going to grab this fill color. But everything in my SVG was in hex. But I'm a hacker, so now we have the hex value. So Control F, I'm so good at this. There it is. So it says I have 1 out of 4 results, and if I look at my robot, this seems pretty reasonable. He has 2 arms, a body, and a head that are that same color. That seems legit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that instead of using this hex value, I want to instead just use a prop that I pass in. And so I'm a great coder. I'm just going to go in, and you can painstakingly watch me just change all these hard-coded hex values to body color. Now, of course, we haven't defined body color yet, but we can just pass it in as a prop. And for lazy consumers of this component, we can give it a default value. If you don't want to define a body color, you're happy with whatever I give you, cool, that's good to me. And so now I could go in, and if my server is running, we can do this. Hang on, guys. I promise you it's live because you saw me type yarn start. Now we have a second robot. It's kind of ugly. No, don't clap. It's really ugly. Yeah, not my best work. This green is a little distressing to look at, honestly. And so a big part of having these components and allowing other users to extend your components and customize them is you want to give them enough options and you want to give them enough of a choice, but you also don't want to overwhelm them with like, okay, you need to pass in these 10 props that like need to be defined, otherwise this component is just broken. And so I don't really want the consumer of this SVG to have to pick like 2 nice colors that go together for this robot's body. So instead I'm going to try to like abstract that work away from them a little bit. So kind of similar to what we did for the main body color is I'm just going to grab the fill and I'm going to change it to the hex value. And I'm going to go back into my code. Control F, boom. So now instead of having to rely on like another prop called like a secondary color or something, what I'm going to do is I shamelessly stole this function from a Stack Overflow post. And so I'm going to use that. You don't really have to worry too much about how it works, because I don't really know how it works. But basically, you give it a color, and then you give it a delta, and that like tells you how much you want to darken or lighten that color. Pretty cool. And so what, my hex value. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace all of this dark green color that's on my robot's body with a darkened color that is reliant on this body color. And so if we don't pass anything into it, it's just going to render the same thing that we had before. So I'm just going to Control F. And we're going to pass in the body color, and because I've done this before, I know that I want to pass in -40. Oh, this one didn't get moved over. That's okay, I'm really good at copy paste. And so now it looks a little bit better, like it's not this horrible pink and green like Frankenstein. But we can do a little bit better. The yellow is kind of weird looking, if I'm being honest. And so we can do the same thing with the yellow. I will just go in, and I'm going to find my color that corresponds to this. Control F. And I'm just going to trust that all 12 of these instances are what I want to change. And I'm going to call that my accent color. And all I'm going to do is Control F and replace that whole line. And then we'll add accent color as another prop. And of course, because we are good citizens making our components as easy to use as possible, we still include this default prop so that if a user doesn't pass in an accent color, that's totally fine. Our component won't be broken. And so in our main app, if we render our robot with an accent color now it's not yellow anymore. We can do a little bit better. Robots aren't like super robotic. Like they can have emotions and stuff. Like that's fine. It's fine to be sad sometimes. So in my design tool, I've gone ahead and I've created a sad mouth. It's very sad. And I can go ahead and export it just like I did before. And this looks very similar. And the problem here is that I have no idea what path corresponds to my robot's mouth. This all looks like gibberish to me. But since I really have no context on this, but I do know that the mouth is the only part of the robot that's changed, I'm a great programmer. I'm just going to diff the files. And now I know the path that corresponds to the robot's mouth. And so I'm just going to grab something. So like the left side is the happy robot, the right side is the sad robot. So I'm just going to grab part of the path value. Watch this. What do you think comes next? I Control F for it. Okay, so like we got one hit, so like I'm pretty confident now that this is the robot's mouth. And we see that like the accent color is yellow, so like it's a fairly good indication. And so I'm also a good programmer. I leave really useful comments. So we're just going to say here that this path is the robot's mouth. And all I know is that in here, I need to figure out what mouth I'm rendering, and it's going to just show up here. And so we can go ahead and define our robot mouth. And we're just going to give it that like original path to start out with, just to make sure that like nothing's broken. And everything seems to be fine so far. So now we can kind of define what emotions we want our robot to express. And so I'm going to do that by just creating an enum, and it's an expression enum. And for now, our robot is either happy or sad. And of course, we want to be able to like let other people determine the emotion of our robot. And so we're going to let our consumer pass this in as a prop. And so we can say that if no expression gets passed in, by default, the robot's a pretty happy thing. And so now we can actually change the like JSX that's being rendered for the robot mouth depending on the expression. And so we'll just check if he's sad, then we'll make our robot mouth. And now we're going to go back into this guy. Let's see. Let's see if we can find him in this mess of an SVG. There it is. Copy paste. Great. And then the only thing we need to remember to do is to change the fill color to the accent color that we're using now. And so nothing's changed so far, but if we go back into our main app, and we got to do some imports, and we say that we want a sad robot, now he's sad. And so you can use this to kind of, do a bunch of various like animations, and like if I had time, we could have like made it like the robot's eyes move or like make him wave, and you can basically like customize all these different parts of your SVG without ever touching like an illustrating tool. The only time that I went into Figma was to get the SVG for my illustration. But if you already have an SVG, you can just use that. And so I think this is really empowering for developers who want to get more into like the design side of things. It's a really nice like transition into like, I don't want to like learn and like have the overhead of like learning this design tool, and like I really feel more comfortable in code. This is a great way to just like explore some of that and like be creative. And people make some insane stuff with SVG animations, like full like little movies. It's crazy. So kind of wrapping things up, SVGs are scalable and accessible, so please use them if it's appropriate. You don't always have to default to JPEGs and PNGs. When you're looking at a piece of code that you have never seen before, that you have no idea what it is, and it seems pretty intimidating and daunting to learn, kind of try to do what I did in this talk. Like look for kind of a unique aspect of what you're trying to look for in the code, and see if you can like dig into that. So for us, it was looking at like picking out the colors and like, I want to edit the things that are this color. Let's see if I can find something in the code that matches that value. And then get creative. I sat in on this talk a while ago by a friend of mine, and she was saying like, just build dumb stuff just because it's fun. And in that process, like you'll make people smile, you'll make people laugh, you'll learn something that like maybe was super easy for you to learn, but maybe for someone else, they had no idea that that was even possible. And so, thank you.